On that winter day over Washington, it looked as if nature itself had decided to test the city's strength. The thick snow was falling slowly and steadily, like a clock counting down to an impending tragedy. The sky was low and viscous. It seemed to be pressing down from above, forcing people on the streets to raise their collars and accelerate their pace. And a few hundred meters above the ground, where the white veil was already hiding the outlines of the city, the Boeing 737 was slowly accelerating. Its dark blue coloring almost disappeared into the winter haze, and only flashing lights tore through the space in short pulses, like a heartbeat that had less and less strength left. The first seconds of takeoff are always full of tension, even if everything is going perfectly. The huge machine, reaching speed, trembles barely noticeably, as if it is gathering itself with a thought. Now, just a little more, and it will lift off the ground. But today, the tremor was different. There was something disturbing about her, too dense, too alive. It seemed that the plane was resisting. It did not want to leave the ground, as if it understood that there was not space and freedom waiting for it at the top, but a struggle for every second. A concentrated silence reigned in the cockpit, hidden from the passengers by a heavy door, and this silence was deceptive. It hid scattered phrases, quick glances at the instruments, uncertain agreement where it should no longer have sounded. Two people, the commander and his first officer, did everything to make the huge machine obey their hands. But with every passing second it became more obvious that something was wrong. Something important, something fundamental was missed earlier on Earth. And now the consequence of this chain of mistakes, small at first glance and unnoticeable from the outside, is that the plane rises too slowly, too heavily, as if pulling an invisible load. Beyond the portholes, passengers saw only a seething white wall. For them, takeoff was just a moment of transition, from the winter of the capital to the warm glow of Florida. Some have already loosened their belts, preparing to relax. Someone was flipping through the airline's magazine. Someone was reclining their seat. Someone was closing their eyes in the hope of sleeping through the entire flight. No one felt the increasing gravity that literally stuck to the plane, as if the weather itself was trying to keep it on the ground. And under the plane, through the snow and darkness, the frozen Potomac could be guessed. A huge ribbon of icy water, which that day became deadly close. A little further on is the 14th Street Bridge, along which cars were moving. Their drivers did not suspect that above them, hidden in the snowfall, there is a boundary between the life and death of several dozen people. And in those seconds, when the plane was already supposed to confidently go up, its nose begins to fall through almost imperceptibly. The instruments are shaking, the warning system is coming to life, the controls are vibrating, as if they are trying to shout about impending trouble. But there is almost no time for the crew. Any attempt to keep the car in the air requires gaining speed, which they simply do not have. Ice, invisible to the eye and deadly to aerodynamics, is doing its job. The plane barely rises above the ground and immediately begins to descend, as if it is exhaling. No one sees it from the outside. For an observer on the bridge, it is just a dark silhouette, barely discernible through the ragged strips of snow, which suddenly appears where it does not belong. It's too low, too close to the ground. It's too heavy. And in the cockpit, they feel every meter of height and every meter of its loss. Both pilots understand. They were trapped. A trap that they themselves created, not with one solution, but with a sequence of small things that are never small things in aviation. They are fighting to the last, trying to pull the car back into the sky, but nature, aerodynamics, and mistakes have left them no room for maneuver. For those who sit in the salon, everything happens suddenly. A sharp decline, vibration, a moment of frightening silence, and a blow of such force that it tears the air, breaks metal, forever changes dozens of destinies. The plane literally crashes into the life of the city, hitting the bridge, and disappears into the icy water below, leaving behind only wisps of smoke, debris, and desperate screams. Those few seconds were the finale for most of the people on board. But in fact, the story began much earlier on Earth at a time when everything could still have been prevented. This tragedy over the Potomac is not an instant disaster, but the end of a long chain of bad decisions, pressures, habits, and lost caution. What happened upstairs is just the culmination. And to understand why those seconds became fatal, we need to go back. By the beginning of the day, to the snow, to the cue for takeoff, to the pilots, who for the first time faced such cold. Go back to where everything could still be changed. Since that morning, Air Florida Flight 90 looked quite normal. There was nothing to suggest that this flight would one day become one of the most talked about episodes in the history of American civil aviation. On the scoreboard in the terminal, the flight was listed as a regular, routine, almost everyday route Washington-Fort Lauderdale. 2,500 kilometers south, towards the sun and palm trees, where January does not bring snowstorms, and people in light shirts are waiting for their friends at the boarding gate. Passengers were gathering in the terminal amid a flurry of delays and announcements. The snowstorm disrupted the schedule, but everyone was already tired of monitoring flight statuses. Waiting became a part of the day. Someone was nervously looking out the window, trying to see at least a piece of the sky behind the continuous white stripes. Someone was holding hot coffee in their hands, as if it could warm not only their fingers, but also their mood. People were talking, laughing, complaining, rescheduling calls. Everything happens on days when the airport lives in a different rhythm. When boarding was announced, the queue stretched to the gate calmly, without fuss. A 12-year-old Boeing 737-200 was waiting under a thick layer of snow, as if someone had carefully dusted it with white powder. From the outside, he seemed a little older than his years. The winter did not spare metal. But inside the cabin, it was warm, quiet, and familiar. Passengers entered one by one, found seats, and put their luggage on the upper shelves. Someone has already taken out a book. Someone has put a jacket under his head in the hope of sleeping. An elderly couple was discussing where they would stay in Florida. A tired-looking young man tried to call home, explaining that the flight was still almost on schedule. Many had plans, vacations, meetings, work. No one imagined how fragile all this would turn out to be. Meanwhile, the crew was preparing for the flight. In the cockpit, in a cramped space saturated with the smell of the dashboard and the heat from the heated systems, the captain and the first officer went to their seats. They did this 100 times, each time with the same mechanics of movement. Unfasten the seatbelt, lower yourself into a chair, check the position of the handles, buttons, and toggle switches. But behind the external routine, the fates of two completely different people were hidden. The commander, Larry Wheaton, a calm man who did not like long conversations, looked collected. He has come a long way to this chair. More than 8,000 hours in the air is an impressive figure for many young pilots. But this watch only partially reflected reality. They hid numerous overlooked little things that are rarely noticed until it's too late. A few years ago, Wheaton was suspended from flying. There were too many violations of standard procedures, too many shortcomings in those things where a pilot should not have weaknesses. He returned to work, passed repeated checks, but the feeling that there were gaps in his training remained. The first officer, Roger Pettit, was his opposite, bright, fast, confident, with that easy military directness that people who flew fighter jets acquire. He had 3,500 flight hours on his shoulders, much of it in the cockpit of an F-15. He knew how to drive at high speeds, how to react with lightning speed, and most importantly, he knew the system. He was described as a pilot with excellent skills. But he also had a serious drawback. He had almost no experience flying in a winter storm like today. His world is a clear sky, a cold troposphere at high altitudes, and clear Air Force procedures. In civil aviation, everything is different. Regulations, interaction with the crew, the importance of collective decisions. The passengers were getting in. The flight attendants smiled and helped me get settled. They were also part of this inconspicuous picture. Young women who are used to schedules, long days, requests, and different people in the salon. For them, this flight is one of dozens. Just another day at work. There were standard announcements in the salon. Passengers confirmed that they had fastened their seatbelts, put away their hand luggage, and turned off their phones. Everything seemed so ordinary that the thought of any danger did not arise at all. Even the snow, falling in thick flakes on the glass, seemed more like a decorative element of winter Washington than a threat. At that time, in the parking lot, everything around the plane resembled a huge white mass. Snow trucks scurried along the runway, clearing lanes, but it was endless work. The snow covered their tracks in just minutes. The airport was closed, opened, closed again. Everything was in motion. Everything required patience. But the most important thing in this story is that no one inside the cabin knew that future problems were already unfolding on board. They haven't happened yet. They haven't made the plane vulnerable yet. But the prerequisites were already there, in the captain's experience, in a climate the crew wasn't used to, in a departure queue that would take too long, in tons of snow that would turn out to be too dense and too cold. No one saw how the invisible ice, which had not yet formed, was already shaping its role in the approaching tragedy. It was a moment of peace before the storm. The very storm that had not yet gained strength, but was already on the threshold. The passengers settled in, the crew got ready. The plane was waiting, and outside, the winter gloom was slowly gathering, as if the atmosphere itself was preparing to witness what would be included in flight safety textbooks that day and forever change attitudes towards winter operations in aviation. When the doors closed, no one thought that this sound would be the last frontier of safety for many. No one guessed how fragile each subsequent step would become. And yet, at that moment, Air Florida Flight 90 was still a regular flight. There was still time, although it was already beginning to melt rapidly. From the outside, it seemed that this day in Washington was just one of the many winter episodes when the weather forced the city to slow down. But for aviation, everything was much more complicated. A powerful cyclone has spread over the eastern United States, covering the states with a dense mass of snow and cold. At its epicenter, airports were operating at their limits. Dispatchers were adjusting routes, crews were waiting for permits, passengers were waiting for any news. And in the middle of this giant winter machine was Reagan Airport, which that day turned into an almost autonomous island surrounded by a wall of bad weather. The snowfall wasn't just heavy, it was persistent. He didn't give a break. When it seemed that he was loosening his grip, after a few minutes he returned with renewed vigor, again covering everything with a fresh layer of white dust. Heavy flakes fell on the wings of the planes, on the glass of the cockpit, on the runways. Snow didn't just fill the space, it changed the rules. He dictated the pace. The air in Reagan's control tower was thick with tension. Behind the large glass panels, the dispatchers watched the snow swirl, which almost obscured visibility. On the monitors, where aircraft markings usually moved smoothly, there was now chaos. Dozens of planes circled in waiting areas, waiting for the opportunity to begin their descent. On the ground, on the taxiways, There were lines of planes patiently waiting in line for takeoff, and every minute of delay was an attempt to win the fight against the growing icing. It was a difficult shift for the airport staff. The controllers coordinated the takeoffs so that at least some window appeared between them to clear the lanes. Snow removal crews cruised endlessly along the platforms. And the pilots, those who were already sitting in their cockpits and watching the snowflakes sticking to the glass, received new instructions each time. Wait, delay, lane closed for cleaning, possibility of takeoff later. And while everyone was waiting, the snow was doing its job. The planes standing at the gates had wings covered with a white layer, which gradually became heavier. On a normal day, it would look almost beautiful, like a winter postcard with clean lines and soft light. But in aviation, every extra gram, every unevenness of the wing shape can change the aerodynamics. On the metal surface of the 737, snow lay in a smooth carpet, hiding the edge of the wing and sometimes gathering in dense layers. From the multitude of tiny flakes, a potentially dangerous combination was born, almost imperceptible but extremely insidious. And in the cabins of the planes queuing, people did not know this. For them, snow was just a part of the winter landscape. For those who were going to fly towards sunny Florida, it was rather a symbol of a change in reality, cold here, warm there. The irony is that this same snowstorm, which many photographed through the glass of the terminal, represented one of the most serious challenges in aviation. On the ground, there was a different atmosphere, fatigue and concentration. The controllers discussed how to distribute the landings so as not to clog the airspace. The commanders of the other flights were talking among themselves, discussing the deterioration of visibility. Someone refused to take off and returned to the parking lot for re-processing. Today it was a normal decision. And someone, on the contrary, tried to use every available minute to slip between snowfall and lane closures. One of the main problems was that Reagan Airport was located in the city on a narrowing of the river among dense urban infrastructure. There was not much freedom of maneuver here, like at other airports. Any delay seemed to cause a domino effect. The chain of planes increased, stopping at one point, and each new flight added another link to it. The passengers on Air Florida Flight 90 only realized that the delay was increasing. But they didn't know the scale of what was happening. How many planes were circling over the city in search of a free corridor? How many flights had already left for alternate airfields? How many snowplow drivers were working almost non-stop to free up at least one lane for a safe departure? In the cockpit, the Flight 90 crew heard all the same things. Delays, waiting, new information from the tower. And perhaps somewhere in the back of his mind, a thought was already beginning to appear. He needed to hurry. We need to take the chance when it comes. But in aviation, haste is the worst ally, especially in this weather. She can imperceptibly change caution to overconfidence and prudence to a desire to make it. And at that time, there was an invisible boundary between the passengers and the crew. Some were just tired of waiting, others were already beginning to feel the growing tension, although they still did not understand how serious it would become. Meanwhile, the snowstorm continued its endless movement. She didn't know that the ice flakes on the wing of one particular Boeing 737 would soon become part of history. She was just doing what she always did, covering the city, cars, people, and planes with an equally indifferent layer of white cold. And Air Florida Flight 90 was still standing, still waiting. It still seemed like a regular flight. But in this queue, among dozens of other planes, it was he who had already begun to lose his chances. He was sitting in the left-hand chair, in the very place where responsibility, experience, and personal history converged. Commander Larry Wheaton looked calm. Smooth voice, confident movements, no fuss. If you look at it from the outside, it would be hard to imagine that there were moments in his career that airlines usually try not to remember. Outwardly, he was a typical captain of a regional airline in the 80s. Calm eyes, neat uniform, and a familiar routine before departure. But behind that outward confidence, there were details that now, years later, seem like an alarming omen. Wheaton joined Air Florida 2 years ago and quickly mastered new types of aircraft. More than 8,000 flight hours is an impressive figure, but quantitative experience does not always match quality. Earlier, at another airline, he had already faced serious problems, which were then solved in training centers and during inspections. Inspections are a big filter in aviation, and most pilots pass them without difficulty. But not him. In May 1980, the Commission recognized his work as unsatisfactory in several key parameters at once. This was a rare case when the comments were not limited to one weak point. They concerned everything from following procedures to proper actions during takeoff, climbing, and landing. The checking instructor explicitly pointed out that the captain does not always follow the checklists, is able to get lost in case of deviations from the norm, and may make mistakes at a time when strict adherence to regulations saves lives. Then he was suspended from flights. It was a loud alarm. It's not exceptional. There are such cases, but it's serious enough to attract attention. After several months of additional training, Wheaton returned to service and was successfully retested. Formally, the problem has been solved. In fact, the question remained open. Less than a year later, there was a new check, a new assessment, and again the mark unsatisfactory. This time it was due to a lack of knowledge of critical elements. Procedures, mandatory memos, systems, and limitations of the aircraft. Such shortcomings are unacceptable for the captain. A mistake on the ground can be fixed, but a mistake in the air is no longer there. Again, 3 days of additional training, a new check, and a successful result. And again, the continuation of a career. Air Florida retained him in his position. Perhaps because of the lack of pilots. Perhaps because, technically, he still passed the retakes. In those years, airlines lived faster than they do today. Market pressure, schedules, and free movement of personnel. All this created conditions in which not every problematic pilot went through such harsh filters as exist now. But the fact remained that there was a man sitting behind the command chair who had serious reservations about discipline and precision of procedures in the past. He himself may have tried to forget about it. After repeated checks, many pilots gained confidence that everything was fixed, that they had solved the problems. And maybe Wheaton believed it too. He was confident, but this confidence sometimes bordered on arrogance. This is exactly the shade of the psychological portrait that experts later discovered. His weak point was precisely the area where aviation does not tolerate compromises. Following procedures where they look routine and familiar. And today, in this blizzardy January, it was just such small things that could play a decisive role. He was sitting in an armchair, looking at the instruments, following the usual steps of pre-flight preparation. Everything looked ordinary, logical, and calm. But next to him, in the right seat, was a man who in many ways surpassed him in piloting technique. The young, fast, attentive Roger Pettit. Perhaps it was this contrast that created hidden tension. Wheaton was older, more experienced by the clock, but Pettit was better at reactions, more accurate in analysis, more confident in difficult situations, even if there were few such situations in his career. And although the first officer formally reports to the captain, there were subtle role fluctuations between them, as the transcript of the negotiations will later show. Pettit had seen, felt, and understood many things a little earlier, but in those years, the final word always remained with the commander. While the plane was parked, None of them suspected that it was this hidden gap in approaches, discipline versus intuition, confidence versus analysis, that would play a fatal role. On Earth, mistakes look harmless. In the air, they become irreversible. And when passengers walked through the narrow corridor of the cabin, when the flight attendants closed the luggage racks, when the plane was preparing to leave the gate, none of them could imagine that in the left part of the cabin there was a man for whom this flight would be the last, and that some of his professional weaknesses were already invisibly woven into the chain of events that would lead them. Everyone is ready for a dramatic outcome. At that moment, everything was quiet, and everything could still be changed. But there are times in aviation when a person doesn't even realize that they've already taken the first step towards the inevitable. In the right seat, opposite the captain, sat a man who embodied a completely different path to aviation. Roger Pettit was one of those pilots whose biography has pages filled with speed, adrenaline, and a constant sense of ultimate control. His youth and most of his early career were spent in the Air Force, where he flew one of the most technologically advanced fighter jets of his time, the F-15. There, in the high-altitude blue, where speed, clouds, and the horizon set a hard pace, he honed the ability to react instantly, see the whole situation, feel the car as if it were an extension of his own hands. It was a school where mistakes were not forgiven and skills were brought to reflex. When Pettit joined civil aviation, he had to rebuild himself. The work here was different, slower and quieter, but no less difficult. You had to not only pilot, but also coordinate your actions with the commander, take passengers into account, follow procedures, and adhere to strict regulations. Nevertheless, his colleagues noted that he adapted easily. Almost 1,000 hours on a Boeing 737 was already a solid base for the former military. He's used to the car, its behavior, its systems. Colleagues described him as a man who combined wit, discipline, and deep technicality. A man who could quickly assess the situation and come up with a solution, sometimes even faster than captains with a lot of experience. He was described as a pilot with excellent physical and mental coordination, which means an incredible amount in aviation. These are not just words. They are a recognition that a person knows how to control dozens of processes simultaneously, while remaining calm and clear. But at the same time, paradoxically, Roger Pettit shared one key flaw with his captain: experience. Not a common one, they were different here. And the experience of winter operations in conditions of heavy snowfall, constant icing, and working with an aircraft that literally minute by minute can become less stable. In his entire career in civil aviation, Pettit had flown in such weather only a couple of times. 2 departures are nothing for a pilot who today will have to assess the condition of the wings, the sensitivity of the rudders, acceleration features, and many nuances that even experienced pilots sometimes say that it only comes with practice. He knew the plane, but he did not know its behavior in the dense winter mass that enveloped Washington that day. And yet, as he sat in his seat and prepared for departure, he had confidence. War teaches peace. He saw fog, rain, turbulence, difficult approaches, many of the things that make a pilot collected. If someone had looked into the cockpit and seen his profile against the dashboard, they would hardly have thought that this man had weaknesses. He looked collected, steady, confident. Indeed, he had a strength that was sometimes lacking for those who studied only in civil aviation. But he was not a commander, and this is a critical factor in the history of Air Florida Flight 90. In aviation in those years, there was a culture that has almost disappeared today. The culture of absolute leadership of the captain. The first officer could doubt, he could ask questions, he could propose a solution, but the commander always had the last word. And even if the first officer saw that something was going wrong, he had to choose the right tone, the right moment, the right wording. The captain had authority by default, sometimes too much. An analysis of the crew's pre-takeoff negotiations, the very recordings that will later become part of the report, shows subtle psychological dynamics. Pettit had seen some deviations before. He asked questions. I noted the details, but every time gently, carefully. He didn't push. He sounded like he was suggesting, not asserting. Maybe out of respect. Maybe it's because of the culture that many pilots of his generation grew up in. Maybe it was because the captain was older, more experienced, and more confident in his command. There is another important observation. Pettit was more attentive to details than his captain. He noticed snow on the wing. He was voicing his doubts. He could feel the difference in the readings of the instruments even before the situation became irreversible. He was the one who first said a phrase that sounded almost prophetic. It seems like it would be nice to be processed again, but he didn't insist. He did not use the force of his tone, which could have forced the commander to reconsider the decision. And yet, despite these weak points, he was a professional, present, technical, capable, and if the role in the cockpit had been distributed differently, perhaps the development of events would have been different. The passengers, of course, didn't know any of this. For them, both pilots were equal, two people in uniform, two faces that they saw only if they accidentally looked into the cockpit during landing. But in reality, the balance between these two people in the cockpit was one of those fragile elements that would later become part of the chain that led to the disaster. That day, Roger Pettit was the man who would see the mistake a little earlier than the captain, who will try to fix it, who will fight to the last for control of the aircraft in those seconds when the fate is almost decided by the icy air and accumulated shortcomings. But for now, it was all ahead. And now he was just sitting in the right-hand seat, looking through the checklists, looking out the windows at the falling snow and waiting for his moment to take control. And neither he, nor the captain, nor anyone else on Earth suspected that this would be one of the hardest missions of their lives. The plane itself, which was parked at the gate that day, seemed ordinary. The Boeing 737-200 is a car that in the early 80s was a familiar part of the American sky, just as yellow taxis were part of the streets of New York. Its recognizable silhouette with short engines and a slightly rough but reliable shape was a symbol of an era when aviation was rapidly growing, becoming more accessible, and flights were no longer something exceptional. This particular board wasn't new, but it wasn't old either. 12 years is a normal age for a car that has survived tens of thousands of takeoffs and landings, flying through storms and clear skies, over cities and oceans. It was part of the fleet of Air Florida, a novice airline that was actively developing in the late 70s and aspired to take its place among the major carriers. And although the company did not have a huge staff, a huge network of routes, or many years of experience, its aircraft were serviced regularly, and the equipment was considered quite reliable. The 737-200 was exactly the kind of aircraft that, in normal winter operation, could safely cope with icing if the crew acted correctly. Its design was not vulnerable in itself. On the contrary, it was built taking into account those standards for which Boeing was famous: durability, stability, the ability to work in different climates. It was a machine that became an extension of the pilot's hands if the pilots acted clearly, attentively, and consistently. But it was with consistency that the problem arose that day, not with the plane, but with the people who controlled it. Everything looked calm from the outside. The wings were covered with snow, still loose, fluffy, almost beautiful. But there was an insidiousness hidden in that beauty. The aerodynamics of an airplane is a subtle thing. It's easy to break it. A small unevenness is enough for a powerful airflow to stop smoothly flowing around the surface of the wing. Even a millimeter of ice can change the characteristics of the wing so much that the aircraft will stop behaving predictably. It's not obvious. Moreover, the aircraft can even react normally at the beginning of acceleration, but at the moment of separation, when the wing is operating at its maximum capacity, any defect becomes critical. And here it is important to understand one thing. The 737-200 could withstand winter flights absolutely normally. It was designed for this. The problem was not that the aircraft was weak or imperfect, but that any machine, even the most reliable, depends entirely on the decisions made by the people at its controls. While the passengers were taking their seats, looking at the soft snow outside the windows, for them this plane was just a transport that would take them from the snowy capital to warmer climes. They saw smooth metal, thick chairs, a glowing exit sign, and the stewardess's quiet footsteps. No one thought about the wing edge, the pressure sensors, or the air intake temperature in the engine. It all seemed remote, technical, and, in a sense, inconspicuous in nature. But it is precisely this invisibility that makes aviation both safe and vulnerable. Most flight situations are handled on the ground. An airplane is a mirror image of the actions that pilots perform before and during flight. And if at least one weak link appears in the chain of these actions, a machine designed for thousands of hours of reliable operation may be in a dangerous state. The technical condition of this 737 was normal. Its engines were not overloaded, the systems were working, and the control checks were carried out normally. But all this was before the captain used thrust reversal at the gate, a step that no engineer predicts in such a situation. Before the snow began to turn into water, and the water into thin ice films that would later play a role. Before the crew lost sight of the most important moment in the checklist, turning on the engine's de-icing system. At that moment, while the plane was standing at the gate, while passengers laid out scarves, turned off their phones and made themselves comfortable, his condition was on the borderline between the norm and future danger. This boundary hadn't been crossed yet, but it was already getting thin. One decision, one wrong step, is enough for the stability of the car to call into question the ability to take off. And yet technology is only part of the story. You can talk as much as you want about the design of the 737, about its aerodynamics, and about the strength of its wing. But the reality is this: the plane was able to handle this day. He could take off, gain altitude, get out of the snow zone and calmly head south, leaving the storm and cold behind. These planes have done this many times. It was done in much more difficult conditions. He wasn't the problem. The problem was a combination of factors around him: the crew's experience, the weather, the pressure of the takeoff queue, the rush, the desire to make it. In those small decisions that seem insignificant on Earth, but become fateful in the air. This Boeing was standing patiently, quietly, as if it was waiting. His engines weren't working yet, his wings weren't sensing oncoming traffic, and his sensors were clean, though not for long. He was ready to work, ready to take off, ready to do his part flawlessly. But tragedy is always born in the area where technology meets human error. In that area that no one notices until it becomes critical. And on this day, such a zone has already begun to form. Quietly, imperceptibly for those who were sitting in chairs and preparing for the flight. The plane looked reliable from the outside. Inside, everything was familiar, but the chain was started and the car became a part of it. Another detail in the story that is about to begin to unfold more rapidly. While the passengers were getting comfortable, it was snowing outside. Persistent, heavy, the kind that does not melt immediately, but lies in a dense, granular layer. It gathered on the wings, flowed down the fuselage, stuck to every protruding part. For an ordinary observer, this snow was just part of a winter day, but for an airplane, it became the first serious threat. When the crew found out that the strip was closed for cleaning, the waiting period began. A long, cold, exhausting one. In such conditions, the most difficult thing almost always begins. The struggle not only with the weather, but also with time. The de-icing liquid works for a limited number of minutes. The longer the plane is in line, the faster the processing effect is lost. And when it snows as heavily as it did that day, the wing literally grows over with new layers every few minutes. The captain understood that. That is why he asked the de-icing team to process the plane 10 minutes before the expected opening of the runway. It was the right decision. The hot solution, flowing down the surface, removed the melted snow, leaving a smooth metal. He protected the wing from the reformation of ice, but only for a limited time. The cycle of such a liquid is not endless. The more intense the snow, the less chance there is that the driver will survive to the end of taxi. When the news came that the lane would not open at the scheduled moment, the captain decided to stop the process. He wanted to move the processing closer to the actual departure time in order to gain those precious minutes. It seemed reasonable. There was nothing at that moment to suggest that 30 minutes would turn into almost an hour. And yet, this small decision will become one of those elements of the chain that will later converge at one point. The new processing was completed after all, when it became clear that the airport was preparing to open. The plane was again covered with a hot jet that washed away everything that had accumulated. At this stage, the wings were clean. The problem was that it was still snowing, and it was snowing heavily. And ahead is a long push out, engine start, and a long queue at the taxiway. When the tractor approached the plane and tried to start ejecting, difficulties began. The equipment was stalling under the wheels. The pusher could not gain traction. Snow and ice made it impossible for him to move the multi-ton car backwards. The passengers in the cabin did not feel it. They just felt like they were sitting still. But in the cockpit, the first attempts at improvisation began. And here the captain made a decision that would later become one of the most critical. He offered to help the tractors by turning on the reverse thrust. Under normal conditions, this is prohibited. Reversing in the parking lot can raise a whole fountain of snow and ice, which will immediately scatter around, hitting the sensors, wings, and leading edge. The technician on the ground warned that this was not allowed according to the procedures. But the captain insisted. He wanted to speed up the process. He wanted to free the plane from parking. He wanted to get into the departure window. He turned on the reverse gear. The roar of the engines, directed forward, raised a whole cloud of snow porridge. A blinding white mass flew at the wings, at the air intakes under the fuselage. That most subtle, almost invisible safety measure, the clean surface of the wing, was breached in just seconds. The warm air from the engines melted the snow, and drops of water rushed along the cold metal forward to the leading edge of the wing. There they turned into ice, thin, dense, imperceptible. This ice will become deadly. At that moment, the captain did not see the result of his decision. The reverse did not help. The plane still wasn't moving. The engines had to be turned off, and the crew had to wait for another tractor. These 10 minutes of waiting were the time when the ice on the leading edge of the wing began to form completely. He was there, but no one noticed him. He was not visible from the cockpit. He was not visible to the passengers. It looked like part of a snow cover, but it was no longer snow, but ice which would not deflate or melt during acceleration. The second tractor coped with its task. The plane slowly pulled away from the gate, finally freeing itself from the parking lot. At that moment, it seemed like the worst part was over, but there was worse to come. The reverse was only the first of a series of steps that, against the background of fatigue, limited visibility, and external pressure from the queue, created conditions for further mistakes. Having started the engines, the crew began to go through the procedure after launch. The checklist, a sacred discipline for the pilot, was supposed to protect against forgotten steps. But this checklist turns into a ritual only under one condition: when each step is performed consciously. In conditions of snow, delays, conversations, queue pressure, many such steps turn into automatic action. When the first officer reached the point engine anti-ice, he, as expected, pronounced it. But the captain, accustomed to the warm states, heard a familiar point and pronounced off, as he had done hundreds of times in other situations. And no one has fixed this error. The de-icing of the engines remained turned off, and the ice that has already formed at the air intakes will not melt now. But these two solutions, reverse and forgotten anti-ice, did not mean disaster. They created prerequisites, but the plane could have survived them if not for everything that happens next. Meanwhile, the snow continued to fall, and time, the most important time, began to melt away faster than the crew could move in line. Every minute while the plane was slowly moving along the taxiway was a minute that ate up the effect of the wing treatment. The passengers, covered with blankets, discussed the weather, yawned, looked at magazines, but in fact their plane began to turn white again. In the cockpit, the commander looked back and saw snow. On the left wing, on the right wing, there is a thin but visible layer. The first officer noticed it too, and for the first time, there is an exchange of comments between them, which, if it had sounded a little more confident, could have been a turning point. We have been working on it for a long time, but he didn't. The queue was long. To lose a place is to wait again, and the result will be the same. A new half-hour wait and the same icy wing surface. The crew was trapped between the right action and the pressure of circumstances. And I chose what seemed most logical at that moment, to stay in line. But the problem was that they had been standing in this queue for too long. Everything could still be changed, but in the dynamics of that day, small decisions clung to each other like snowflakes on cold metal, forming something much heavier than it seemed at first. Taxiing on such days turns into a slow, almost viscous motion, when each plane moves with caution, as if wading through a white swamp. For passengers, it's just a long wait. They only feel smooth jerks when the plane moves forward a few meters and stops again. But for the crew, every minute means much more. They see what is hidden from the passengers. How the snow gradually returns to the wings, how it falls in thin layers, how this layer becomes thicker. They know that the processing done at the gate no longer guarantees security. When Flight 90 began to move slowly along the taxiway, it turned out to be the 11th in a long line. In front of him were dozens of planes that had been idling in the frosty wind for minutes, waiting for their turn. And all of them, without exception, faced the same problems: ice, snow, fatigue, time pressure. But at that moment, the crews of the front planes may have been in a more advantageous position. They were already approaching the runway. They were already closer to the moment of acceleration, when the oncoming airflow would blow the snow off the surface of the wing. Flight 90 was moving slowly, looking at the tail of the car ahead, and realized that their turn was still far away. The passengers inside hardly paid attention to how long the journey took. Someone was looking out the window at the sparse lights of the taxiway, sinking into the snow. Someone was closing their eyes, just wishing that the plane would be in the air as soon as possible. Someone even smiled. The white space around them seemed too cozy, as if the city had temporarily taken shelter under a blanket. But in the cockpit, the mood was different. The first officer, always attentive, was the first to talk about the fact that the treatment had been a long time ago. He did not speak in a commanding tone, but rather in a tone of reminder, like a person who does not want to sound intrusive, but still feels the need to indicate anxiety. "We've been working on it for a long time," he said. "It wasn't panic, it wasn't fear, it was just a fact. A small phrase that should have made you think." The captain turned and looked back. The view from his side was worse than from Petit's side, but he saw it too. There was a layer of snow on the wing from a quarter to a half-inch. Not much, it would seem. Almost nothing for the passenger. But for an airplane wing, it is a potentially fatal unevenness that can change the distribution of lift. In a normal situation, any experienced captain would immediately understand by such signs. The aircraft needs to be returned for reprocessing. But there was no normal situation today. Cue. Pressure. Limited window for takeoff. Dozens of other flights are behind us. And in front of them, dozens of those who also stood all this eternity in the cold. To go back would mean losing almost an hour and ending up in the same queue again. And the snow would have continued to fall anyway. It is decisions like this, in which there is no right or wrong, but only imperfect options, that distinguish difficult days in aviation. The crew didn't feel like they were doing anything risky. They saw a lot of other planes around them, and none returned for a second deasing. Everyone was walking towards the strip. Everyone took off. Everyone disappeared into the white gloom. It would seem that if they can, why can't we? This psychological trap is called normalization of deviations. When there are no direct signs of danger, and everyone around them acts the same, the risk seems less. At that moment, the Flight 90 crew found themselves in it. And yet Pettit, more technical, more attentive, said one more thought out loud: "We need to be processed again." The captain agreed, but only on the level of abstract reasoning, as an idea, not as a call to action. And at that moment, when both of them were talking about the risk, when the words processing, ice, standing for a long time had already sounded several times, the queue was moving forward. The plane ahead began to maneuver, and Flight 90 also reached for it. This small shift of the wheel, this quiet hum of the engines, which slightly increased the revs, seemed to distract the crew from the very essence of the problem. They continued moving. They chose the way forward. Among all this, there was another important detail: the atmosphere. There was a slight relaxation in the cabin. One of the flight attendants called the cabin, allowing herself a joking tone. She said it was beautiful outside, that she liked the day. The situation itself seemed unusual, even interesting, but not dangerous. This lightness seemed to extend to the crew as well. Against the background of the long wait and monotony, they allowed themselves small conversations, commented on the snow, and discussed the weather. These human moments, natural and alive, would sound almost impossible today. The modern culture of CRM, crew resource management, would change the whole style of communication. But in 1982, the level of formality that is considered the norm today was still in the process of being formed. Back then, the crews allowed themselves more informality, more conversations. And in this informality, the focus on the most important thing was sometimes lost. Meanwhile, the snow continued to fall. He lay down on the wings, on the stabilizer, on the tips. He was everywhere. And every minute made it a little tighter, a little more dangerous. And there are only a few planes ahead. The queue was moving. Their moment was approaching. The cabin was filled with quiet but growing tension. Not panic, but tension, which is felt only by those who know exactly where the comfort zone of the plane ends. And Flight 90 was approaching this border. The queue slowly stretched forward. Flight 90 was moving closer and closer to the beginning of the taxiway, where other planes were already lining up ahead, as if in a narrow corridor between snowdrifts and streaks of light. The snow seemed thicker than before. He no longer looked light and fluffy. Now he was part of the heavy winter mass that hung over the airport, as if squeezing maximum patience out of the crews. When the Boeing Air Florida stopped once again, the captain looked back again. The left wing was covered with snow, about a quarter or half an inch. On the right, the first officer's picture was similar. A white layer that shouldn't have stayed on the surface for so long. Under normal conditions, snow is blown away during takeoff, but it's just snow. Ice is not. And at that moment, the captain uttered a phrase that would later become one of the most discussed moments of the investigation. He noticed that there was a DC-9 aircraft in front, with engines located in the tail section. These engines are located high enough above the ground, and when they gain power, their jet stream is directed back and down, creating a dense, hot stream of air. At first glance, a logical idea was born in the captain's head. If you put the wing under this stream, the hot exhaust will be able to at least partially blow away the snow. He said it out loud. His voice was calm, as if he were offering a completely natural solution. The first officer, who was more technical and attentive, reacted with restraint. He said it didn't make much sense. The snow would come off anyway when running. It was a gentle, neat way of saying, this doesn't need to be done. In other circumstances, he could have insisted more strongly. But now, when dozens of planes were already taking off in the same conditions, his words sounded more like an opinion than a warning. And the captain made a decision. He began to turn the plane around so that the DC-9 jet hit the left wing of Flight 90. A stream of hot air and gas hit the surface, sweeping away the white snow. From the outside, it even looked effective. The snow disappeared, the white spot dissolved, and the metal of the wings became visible again. But what looked like a solution was actually the beginning of an irreversible process. The jet stream not only blew away the snow, it melted it. The high exhaust temperature turned snow into water. Water flowed down the wing's back, along the flaps, along the leading edge, along the thin slits of the aerodynamic elements. And when it reached the colder parts of the wing, and they were under constant frosty pressure all day, the water turned into a thin layer of ice. It was not loose, noticeable ice. It was a dense, smooth film that followed the shape of the wing, but at the same time made its surface perfectly smooth where there should be micro-roughness, and vice versa, rough where the surface should be perfectly smooth. The ice couldn't be seen from the cockpit. He didn't look like a danger. It looked like a smooth, shiny surface under a thin layer of snow. Then the captain turned the plane in the other direction to put the second wing under the jet stream. Again, a stream of air passed over the surface. Again the snow disappeared, and drops appeared again, which turned into ice in the blink of an eye. At that moment, the line between snow will fly off during takeoff, and a dangerous surface will form on the wing, had already been crossed. Later, experts will say that this maneuver was critical, that no procedure permits such an action, that such a thing is a direct violation of winter operation. But at that moment, the captain thought otherwise. He saw around him a lot of planes that had already taken off. He saw that everyone was moving forward, no one was returning to the dealership. And he saw a layer of snow which, in his opinion, needs to be removed. This combination of visibility, cue pressure, and the desire to do something to improve the situation led to the wrong choice. However, the feature that the crew didn't know about was even worse. On the 737th aircraft, it is the wingtips that are the areas where icing causes particularly dangerous aerodynamic effects. If ice forms there, Small changes in the distribution of lift create a forward displacement of the center of lift. This means that the aircraft, when trying to take off, abruptly nods nose up, as if something is tossing it. It's always a surprise for pilots. And in conditions of winter takeoff, in conditions of insufficient thrust, it is a deadly surprise. This is physics, which does not forgive those who try to fight it with non-standard methods. But in the cockpit, everything seemed to be within the normal range. They kept moving. Pettit, as a person who feels the plane better, looked at the instruments and noticed small but important deviations. He saw that one engine was showing a different operating power. They discussed this and explained to themselves that the DC-9 jet stream could affect the air pressure. And none of them thought that the impact had already happened, but it was completely different. The plane was moving forward. Snow began to fall on the wing again, now on top of a thin ice base. It was a mixture that couldn't be seen from the cockpit, but it has already completely changed the aerodynamic properties of the wing. Flight 90 was still in the queue. They already felt that their turn would come soon. They had already heard the voices of other crews on the air. They were already listening to the dispatcher's commands, who was trying to schedule departures between landings. But the most important thing has already happened. The ice began to grow. On the wings, on the leading edge, on the engine sensors. And now, no matter how much they talked about the snow, no matter how much they looked back, it was impossible to see the true danger. The next step is moving forward, and only forward. As the queue brought Flight 90 a few dozen meters closer, the snowfall began to seem more than just a part of the weather. It turned into a wall through which the crew looked as if into thick milk. Visibility crumbled into grains. The light of the taxiway lights seemed soft and blurred. The plane ahead was slowly accelerating, heading towards the runway, and the Air Florida 90 followed it, adjusting to its trajectory. A barely noticeable tension was building in the cabin. It wasn't expressed in voices or words. It was in pauses, in glances, in quick assessments of instruments. And the first person to sense that the situation was getting out of control was once again First Officer Roger Pettit. He looked at the engine readings, exactly where any technical pilot looks in such conditions, trying to figure out how confidently the power plant is working. And I saw that something didn't add up. The right engine showed a lower value of the EPR, engine pressure ratio, a key indicator of engine air pressure, according to which pilots set takeoff power. It was a worrying sign. Normally, both engines should work almost synchronously, especially on the ground, when there are no external conditions that can significantly affect the pressure on the sensors. But now one of them was showing that he was pulling less. Pettit voiced the observation calmly, but with a note of concern. He suggested that it was due to the turbulent flow from the plane ahead. It sounded logical. The hot air raised by the tail arrangement of the DC-9 engines could create a modified flow that affected one of the 737 engines. The captain agreed quickly, almost automatically. And at that moment, fate intervened in the conversation. Because the crew found a plausible explanation for what was actually the first signal of a serious technical problem. But they didn't know the truth, and they couldn't have known from the cockpit. The reason was different. When the captain turned on the thrust reversal at the gate, a stream of snow and slush rushed forward, directly onto the air intakes. The hot air melted the snow, and the water flowed down onto the leading edge of the engines. And there, at a temperature of about 0, she froze. Not on the blades, as is often thought, but on the pressure sensor, a tiny tube responsible for measuring the air parameters at the engine inlet. This ice distorts the readings. It makes them higher than in reality. This means that the instruments show the engine is working harder, although in fact there is less thrust. This is a subtle, hidden danger. She's almost invisible, but it is fatal. The right engine showed an underestimated value. But soon ice will form on both, and then the instruments will show the takeoff power, which in fact will not be. Pettit was looking at the indicators. He felt that something was wrong. He compared the engine's effort to what he should feel when taxiing. He saw the slightest deviations and tried to explain them by external factors because the whole cabin already lived in the paradigm. Snow, delay, unusual weather. Everything is strange, but possible. And yet, he felt that there was an anomaly. He even came back to that thought later. But this inner anxiety did not take the form of an order. In those years, the first officer had to be careful when expressing doubts. The aviation tradition of those years was as follows. The commander makes decisions, the first officer advises, but does not argue. This culture has become an invisible participant in the catastrophe. Meanwhile, the plane was moving forward, closer to the runway. The control tower was plunging into its own chaos. No matter how much the snowplows worked, the strip was covered with snow dust again. Planes were circling over the city, waiting for permission to land, and the controllers did everything to fit the departures into this chaos. When Flight 90 reached the waiting point in front of the runway, the dispatcher for the first time gave a command that sounded unusually harsh. Air Florida 90, be ready for immediate departure. Be ready for immediate takeoff. It wasn't a request, it was pressure. There was already a plane behind them on a short final flight. His speed was fast. There was no permission to cancel the takeoff. The dispatcher simply hoped that the 737 would have time to leave. This is a violation of the standards of those years. But they did it anyway. The Flight 90 crew heard in the dispatcher's voice exactly what every pilot hears when an airliner approaches behind them. Take off as fast as possible. This is not a literal instruction, but a feeling created by circumstances. The psychological pressure that the crew gets under in the cockpit. And this pressure has imperceptibly influenced everything that will happen next. Pettit began to pull the plane onto the runway. Snow billowed under the nose. Lights ran along the sides. From behind, above the city, the silhouette of another plane appeared, which was landing too close, too fast, it's too dangerous. And the Flight 90 crew realized they don't have space for pauses, for the sake of doubt, for refusal. They have to take off. Meanwhile, there was ice on their engine blades. There is ice on the engine sensors. There is ice on the leading edge of the wing. There is ice on the wingtips. And this invisible enemy was preparing his roll. A roll that could no longer be avoided. The plane took up position in front of the runway. Pettit put his hands on the deadlifts. The commander nodded. And the sky, hidden behind a white veil of snow, was waiting for their decision. The moment the plane reached the center line, it seemed as if the world had narrowed to a few meters around the cockpit. Everything on the right, left, and back disappeared into the white wall of snow. There was only a long, vaguely discernible streak of light ahead, stretching into a gray infinity. And under this strip is the same ice, invisible and ruthless. Pettit, who was sitting in the right-hand seat, carefully took up the deadlifts. His fingers rested lightly but confidently on the metal handles, as if he had done it hundreds of times in all weather conditions. He slowly began to propel them forward, setting the engines to takeoff mode. Inside the cabin, the hum began to increase, and the passengers, some habitually, some a little tensely, felt the vibration under their feet. But it was immediately clear in the cockpit that something was wrong. The arrows of the EPR, the main thrust parameter, shot up sharply, showing a power higher than that set by the first officer. It was weird, wrong. For an experienced pilot, such readings would look suspicious. But the captain, who was already used to explaining oddities by the cold, immediately said, "It's very cold outside, that's why." He was wrong. The arrows didn't show what was really happening. The ice on the sensors created a false picture, as if putting a mask on the real state of the engines. According to the instruments, the power was. In reality, there wasn't enough traction. Pettit could feel it. He felt the difference between what the engines were supposed to do and what was happening under the wings. The plane was accelerating, but slower than it should have been. This acceleration was not confident, bright, or powerful. It was heavy, sluggish, as if the plane was breaking through something invisible, viscous. He was trying to match the data. He looked at the temperature, the RPM, the vibration. The parameters seemed normal, but the pilot's inner feeling said otherwise. He said it out loud. "Something's wrong," but the captain didn't pay attention to it again. They were standing on the runway, and a plane was already approaching behind them. There was one thought in his voice, in his pace. "We need to take off." It wasn't panic. It was confidence mixed with the pressure of circumstances. He wanted to make it, and he assured himself that everything was fine. Pettit tried to set the desired power value again. He pulled the rods back a little, setting the correct value on the instruments. But the instruments were lying. In fact, he turned down the thrust even more. Now the plane was taking off with a power significantly lower than the calculated one. The plane continued to accelerate, but too slowly. The white snow merged with the strip. Lights flashed by the side like blurred stripes. In the cabin, where people were sitting waiting for the lift, no one knew that the speed was increasing painfully slowly, that the wings were already covered with a thin layer of ice, that the aerodynamics were broken. The numbers sounded in the cockpit, precise, mechanical. 80 knots. Checked. The engines were making noise, snow was flying on the glass, and the nose was vibrating slightly. Pettit looked at the instruments again and saw the discrepancy again. He said that the indicators look wrong. His voice sounded restrained, but without lightness. It was the voice of a pilot who senses danger. But the captain brushed aside his doubts again. At 120 knots, they reached the point where, in 1982, the decision could no longer belong to the first officer. Only the captain could give the command to abort takeoff. And the captain didn't say those words. He said, "V1, rotate." Pettit pulled the wheel back. The plane, as if reacting too abruptly threw its nose up. No one in the cabin expected such an instant rise. This was the reaction of an aircraft whose center of lift had shifted forward due to the ice. In a normal state, the nose rises smoothly, sedately. But here it's as if someone pushed the plane into the air, upsetting the balance. And then the worst began. The airflow, instead of smoothly flowing around the wing, began to break away. The slats and flaps did not feel steady pressure. The ice on the tips interfered with the correct distribution of lifting force. The plane took off, but without a reserve of speed, without stable air conditioning, and without the ability to gain altitude. And then there was a sound in the cockpit that pilots never want to hear during takeoff. Stick shaker. The steering wheel began to vibrate, a signal that the wing was about to lose lift, that the plane was about to crash. Pettit immediately tried to lower his nose, the right action in such a situation, but there was almost no height, only a few hundred feet. He was trying to maintain speed at the same time, to prevent the plane from overturning and to avoid a collision with the ground. In the cockpit, the officer spoke briefly, quickly, almost on instinct. Push. Push down. Just a little. I'm holding. But we're losing. The plane was barely able to stay in the air. He rose to about 350 feet, which is only 100 meters. Under normal takeoff conditions, it should have been much higher. But he couldn't get up. There was not enough thrust. The wings were heavy. The air was dense and icy. And the plane slowly but inevitably began to slide down. Pettit, understanding everything to the end, made one last attempt to save them all. He abruptly increased thrust to maximum, as if trying to push the plane up. But it's too late. The engines couldn't give enough power. They were tricked by the ice. The last words were heard in the cockpit, filled with despair and an attempt to keep control. We only got 5. Keep it. Keep it. But the car was losing altitude. Not abruptly, but heavily, fatally, as if she was being pulled down by a magnet that they could not defeat. Seconds later, a bridge appeared ahead, the 14th Street Bridge. Car headlights, dark silhouettes, people who didn't even know that a huge car was coming towards them. Flight 90 hit the bridge. The metal crumpled. The wing hit the cars. And immediately after that, the plane crashed into the icy waters of the Potomac. The cabin was dark, screaming, and cold. Most of the fuselage went under the ice almost instantly. That's how the takeoff ended, which a few minutes ago seemed ordinary. But the story of the disaster was just beginning, because there's an investigation ahead, effects, and most importantly, an understanding of how a chain of small human decisions led to what happened over the Potomac. The impact was like a huge car crashing into the silence of the entire city. A moment ago, there was thick snow, the roar of engines, and a tremor in the cabin. A moment later, the sharp, deafening sound of metal breaking, twisting, bending under incredible force. Flight 90 entered the bridge from below, as if trying to slip under it, but the distance was not enough. The wing caught several cars. One of them rose into the air like a toy thrown by someone's giant hand. Second, just one. And then the plane disappeared under the bridge, plunging down into the icy mouth of the Potomac River. There was no warning noise. There was no explosion, flash, fire, none of the things that people usually imagine during plane crashes. There was only a crack, metal breaking, and then a thud on the water. The water closed over the fuselage as if it had swallowed it whole. The passengers, many of whom were strapped in, didn't even have time to realize what had happened in the first seconds. They felt a sharp jolt, the lights went out, and the cold broke through, as if an icy hand had torn open the wall between the outside world and the cabin. The cabin tilted. The water rushed in through the cracks. Dense, dense, dark. She crawled into the aisles, propped up her legs, and climbed higher and higher. People tried to free themselves from the straps, but some were pinned down by chairs or structural elements. Those who were closer to the rifts felt the air disappear and how cold everything became. Screams could be heard on the surface, where parts of the hull remained above the water. Weak, choking, uneven. The darkness of the snowfall swallowed them up. A strong wind was blowing, which cut the skin like thin blades. The temperature was below freezing. The water was deadly cold. A few seconds in her turned into an agonizing struggle for the ability to breathe. A few minutes in danger of consciousness. Most of the fuselage went underwater immediately, but several parts of it, as if pressed by ice, remained drifting near the surface. Fragments, paneling elements, seat cushions. All this turned into small islands to which the survivors clung. There weren't many of them, But they were 5 people, those whose position in the cabin was randomly combined with the direction of the fault, were thrown out of the plane or were able to get out themselves. They clutched at pieces of the fuselage, trying to stay on the surface. Their bodies were frozen. Their breathing was ragged. They couldn't scream loudly. There was too little air, too much pain from the icy water. At that moment, chaos reigned on the bridge. People were getting out of cars that stopped abruptly, trying to figure out what had happened. Someone saw only the silhouette of the plane disappearing under them. Someone saw the pieces flying apart. Someone heard a muffled thud. It was only after that that they saw the water, and there were human silhouettes clinging to anything. Many rushed to the fence, shouting to passers-by and trying to call the emergency services. The cars on the bridge were in disarray. Some were damaged. One was badly hit by a wing. The snow continued to fall. It seemed that nature itself was trying to hide what had happened, to make it less visible, less distinct. Rescue vehicles were already heading for the shore, but they were far away. The roads are slippery. The driveways are clogged with snow. The boats are not ready yet, and the icy water makes any movement dangerous. The people on the shore could only watch and pray that someone would hold out until the arrival of specialists. At this time, in the center of the river, several survivors were struggling, holding on to pieces of metal with their last strength. Their faces were getting whiter by the second. They hardly moved, they couldn't. The water took away energy faster than the brain had time to issue commands. They were just trying not to drown. They were trying to wait for help, which seemed to be going too slowly. Someone, one of the passengers, tried to hold the woman next to him, putting his last strength into it. She slipped out of her hands. The water made everything slippery. Her body became unyielding from the cold. After a few more seconds, he stopped holding on by himself. But his grip remained surprisingly firm, as if he wasn't even focusing his survival instinct on himself. The 5 survivors held on. One of them, a man who later became a symbol of the entire disaster, passed the lifeline to others before allowing himself to be helped. He was in a state where his muscles no longer obey, but there was something more inside him, the desire to give others a chance. When the first rescuers reached the water, the picture in front of them was almost unreal. Pieces of metal, dark silhouettes, an icy edge along the shore, and people who were slowly drowning right in front of their eyes. Only 5 of the passengers and crew will survive. The rest died either on impact with the bridge or in the first minutes after the fall, when the water took away the heat faster than a person can realize. But in those minutes, between the blow and the rescue, in the center of the snow-covered capital, amidst the cold and wind, life clung to consciousness. People were fighting. They didn't give up. They didn't scream. They couldn't. But in every movement, in every breath, there was what would later be called human resilience. The disaster has already happened, but the consequences, human and professional, were just beginning to take hold. When the water of the river swallowed the wreckage of Flight 90, the city did not understand the scale of what had happened for a long time. But after a few hours, when the first large parts of the fuselage were lifted to the surface, it became clear. This is not just a tragic combination of circumstances. This is not bad weather. This is not one wrong step. This is a chain of events, each of which was small, but together they formed a line leading to disaster. Shortly after the accident, representatives of the National Transportation Safety Board, NTSB, arrived at the scene. Their work always starts the same way. Silence, caution, meticulousness. They're not looking for the guilty, they're looking for answers. Any detail can become the thread that will lead to understanding. Each piece is a piece of a mosaic. In the early days, the main task was to get everything out of the water that could give traces. Metal, panels, wiring fragments, machine components. It wasn't easy in winter conditions. Ice covered the surface, debris was scattered over a large area, and the water carried small parts far downstream. But step by step, the experts reconstructed the picture of what happened in the air. One of the most important data sources is the flight recorder, which records the crew's conversations. Under the conditions of a sharp impact, he survived. And when the experts began listening to the recordings, the last line of events was revealed to them, not in the form of debris, but in the form of voices. Voices that were gradually losing confidence. Voices in which doubt struggled with the desire to make it. Voices that at some point stopped being just a working dialogue and turned into a cry of struggle. And already in the first minutes of the analysis it became clear. The disaster did not start in the air. It started on Earth, in the snow, where the crew made decisions that individually did not seem catastrophic, but collectively became fatal. The first thing that the experts noted was the use of thrust reversal at the gate. This decision did not comply with winter operating procedures. It lifted snow and slush into the air, tossed them to the leading edges of the wings and engines. At this stage, ice began to form imperceptibly, under a thin layer of wet snow, which the crew perceived simply as part of the weather. The next discovery is the fact that the de-icing system of the engines was turned off. The recording of the negotiations showed that the crew uttered this checklist item automatically, without a conscious analysis of the conditions. This solution allowed the ice on the pressure sensors to gain a foothold without melting. This ice caused the instruments to show higher power than they actually were. The third element was maneuvering under the DC-9 jet stream. This action might seem like a quick way to get rid of snow, but in fact it became an amplifier of the problem. The hot stream melted the snow, turning it into water, which then froze with a smooth, even layer of ice on the most critical areas of the wing. The experts noted, this decision directly contradicted the recommendations, as it accelerates the formation of ice. And then the final analysis of the takeoff acceleration. The black box recorded every second. The speed grew slower than normal. The plane did not get the necessary thrust. When the separation speed was reached, the nose rose sharply, which means that the center of lift shifted forward due to the characteristic icing of the tips. This effect was known but rarely seen. The experts immediately realized that the plane had lost its aerodynamic stability. It was all like a long chain of loosely connected events. But from the NTSB's point of view, every element was critically important. The official NTSB report stated, the cause of the disaster was a combination of the crew's lack of experience in winter operations, mistakes in following procedures, and incorrect use of icing prevention methods. But this was only part of the conclusions. Special attention was paid to the captain. His history of inspections, repeated exams, and discipline observations has become the subject of serious analysis. The investigators asked, why did Air Florida leave him in command? Why didn't the repeated failures signal a review of his status? These questions were raised so loudly for the first time. They sound almost familiar today, but in the early 80s it was a breakthrough in the industry's thinking. Another critical conclusion concerned the interaction of the crew. In the negotiations, it is clear that Pettit was doubtful, that he felt something was wrong, that he was trying to point out the oddities. But in those years, the system of interaction in the cockpit was different. The captain had the absolute right to have the last word. And the first officer, even if he saw a problem, could not always insist on a solution. The NTSB pointed out, a new culture is needed. A culture in which the co-pilot has not only the right, but the duty to challenge the commander's decision if it seems wrong. This is how the CRM Crew Resource Management System was born. Its roots are in the disasters of the 70s and 80s, but Flight 90 was the key example. Experts also pointed out the need to change the approach to winter operation. New aircraft handling systems, new standards for the distance between handling and takeoff, new icing control rules, new categories of de-icing liquids, new requirements for airfield training, new simulators with winter scenarios. It is thanks to this investigation that separate processing zones have appeared at airports around the world today. Dealing stations located near the runway. Now the aircraft is processed literally before takeoff to minimize the risk of ice formation. It was after Flight 90 that the wing reinspection clauses appeared in the instructions of many airlines. Onboard power management systems have appeared, independently controlling thrust. There are clear rules for visual inspection before takeoff. Pilots are required to go out for inspection or call a ground specialist if there is even the slightest suspicion of ice. The NTSB did not blame just one person, but he showed it for sure. The disaster was the result of a culture in which minor deviations began to seem the norm, and that culture ended over the Potomac. But its end marked the beginning of a new era of aviation security. When the wreckage of Flight 90 was gradually lifted onto the shore, when the river calmed down, when the screams were replaced by silence, it seemed that the tragedy was over. But in reality, it was from this moment that another story began. The story of how one disaster became a turning point for an entire industry, how it became a lesson that no one else had the right to forget. In all the offices where aviation safety decisions were made, the name Air Florida Flight 90 became a symbol of how dangerous a sequence of small mistakes can be. No malicious intentions, no serious malfunctions, no external factors that could blame the fault on an accident. Just a normal winter day. There's only a cue for the lane. Only the snow that fell on the wing. Just a few wrong decisions, each of which seemed insignificant. That is why this disaster has left such a strong mark. After the investigation, the country began reviewing the entire system of winter crew training. New scenarios have appeared in the simulators. Waiting in line for hours, irregular dispatcher instructions, time pressure, false readings, system failure, icing in various forms. Now the pilots weren't just training in technology, they were learning how to make decisions under pressure. We learned to say stop, even when the dispatcher is in a hurry. We learned to trust our senses, not just our instruments. The CRM system, born in the 70s, has received a powerful boost. It was made mandatory. It has been implemented in all airlines. She changed the culture of communication in the cockpit so much that today a situation in which the first officer could not insist on his point of view is simply unthinkable. It's a different era. The disaster also changed the very approach to dealing. Separate platforms have begun to be built at airports, from which the aircraft immediately heads to the runway after processing. New standards have been introduced for the duration of action of de-icing liquids, the so-called holdover times. There are new types of liquids that are more resistant to snow and frost. Now any crew member is obliged to request a re-treatment if the wing is in doubt, and no one else has the right to consider it superfluous. Many engineers and pilots say that this particular disaster was the moment when the industry realized that ice is not a small thing, not a temporary inconvenience, not part of the winter landscape. Ice began to be perceived as a full-fledged threat that needs to be dealt with in advance, and not at the moment when the plane is already on the runway. But perhaps the most important consequence of this tragedy was neither technical nor procedural. It was human. The 5 survivors, those who managed to stay in the icy water, who fought for their lives, who clung to the wreckage so desperately that their hands lost their sensitivity, became a living reminder that sometimes survival depends on a fraction of a second, on the location of the chair, on what you have time to grab. Their stories then went around the world. And among the dead were those whose last moments were a reflection of extraordinary bravery. One male passenger was passing a lifeline to others before allowing himself to be pulled out. He was so weakened by the cold that the rescuers could not hold him back. He disappeared under the water, becoming a symbol of the fact that human resilience sometimes turns out to be above fear. The residents of Washington who were on the bridge that day also performed what would later be called a civic feat. Someone rushed to the railing. Someone waved to the rescuers. Someone shouted to passers-by. Someone brought ropes and blankets. The rescue helicopter lifted the water into the air with an icy wind. The pilots maneuvered at a height of several meters, risking their own safety to pull out those who were in the water. This episode was later shown all over the world as an example of how sometimes heroes appear where no one is waiting for them. But, as in all tragedies, the most difficult thing is awareness. The realization that everything could have been different, that it was enough to turn on the engine de-icing, that it was enough to abandon the reverse at the gate, that it was enough to stay on the sidelines without exposing the wing to the jet stream, that it was enough to insist on a second treatment, that it was enough to cancel the takeoff in a moment of doubt, that it was enough to look at the wing again. And yet, each time, the crew chose a small solution, a small step forward, a small excuse, and all these small elements combined into one big event. Perhaps none of them could have imagined that the consequences would be like this. Perhaps they thought they were just coping with a difficult day. Perhaps they believed that the assistance system, the support of the dispatcher, experience, logic, all together would lead them to a safe takeoff. But the chains leading to disasters always look exactly like this, logical, until they reach their last point. As a result, Flight 90 was not only a tragedy, but also a lesson that was heard, a lesson that was fixed in documents, in simulators, in culture, a lesson that has changed aviation no less than hundreds of technical innovations. Today, when modern airplanes take off in the cold, in the snow, in the icy wind, every procedure, every inspection, every step is a reflection of the conclusions that were drawn after the Potomac tragedy. And every crew working in winter conditions is aware that ice is not just a part of the weather. This is a factor that requires full attention, focus, and respect. Planes have become safer. Procedures are stricter. Crews should pay more attention. Airlines are more responsible. And somewhere along this long journey, in every new norm, in every training, in every updated checklist, the memory of Air Florida Flight 90 lives on. Not as a tragedy, but as a point after which aviation became better. This is a story about how one mistake can cost a life, but also about how one tragedy can save thousands.